Hi, my name's Sam, and today I'm going to deliver a short session for you on how to survey for mammals and common field signs that you might see of them. So just for a little bit of background on me, I am currently chair of Shropshire Dormouse Group, which means I spend a lot of my time surveying for the hazel dormouse, which are an endangered and very cute creature. I have also sat on the Shropshire Mammal Group Committee previously for a couple of years. I've been a trainee and volunteer with the Shropshire Wildlife Trust. And I'm also a self-professed mammal detective. So what that means essentially is I spend a lot of time out in the countryside, sniffing the air for fox urine and getting close to mammal poo, which I absolutely love. To get the most out of this session today, I'd highly recommend that you have a pen and paper to hand. There will be a few questions for you to have a go at answering. You don't have to, but if you treat this like an interactive session, you will get a little bit more out of it. Okay, so let's start with the question, what is a mammal? And this is a question for you to have a go answering. So if you would like to have a go, pause the video now and jot down some answers. So what I'm looking for are three key features that make a mammal, which means that put an animal in the taxonomic class Mammalia. And those three key features are that they have mammary glands, which means that they produce milk to feed live young. They generally have a covering of hair or fur. And they can produce heat from within using a process called endothermy. So the simplified version of that, you could say that they're warm-blooded, but strictly speaking, not all mammals are warm-blooded. But specifically, they can produce heat from within with this process we call endothermy. What British mammals can you think of? So this is another opportunity for you to pause the video and have a go at listing as many British mammals as you can think of. I'm not going to list them all for you now, but coming up are some photos of just some of them. Apologies in advance for the quality of some of these photos, but they are all mine. So let's have a look at some British mammals we might see when we're out and about. We've got the bank vole, got the brown rat, wood mouse, a fox, hedgehog, badgers. A very poor quality photo, but it was the first time I saw live badgers and I was very, very excited. The hazel dormouse, grey squirrel, common shrew, yellow-necked mouse, and polecat. So, of course, haven't covered all British mammals there. Hopefully your list covered some of them and possibly many, many more. So why do we record mammals? Well, it helps to improve the knowledge and understanding of British mammals in a few ways. So recording mammals helps to contribute to atlases, and these atlases tell us the distribution of mammal species. They're essentially maps of those records, so we know where mammals live, where they're present. And over time, that can help us to monitor changes to these distributions. So we can see whether mammals have become more prevalent in certain areas or whether they seem to have disappeared from some areas. Recording mammals may also help us to protect species and their habitats from development. So there are certain mammals that are protected by law. That's them and their nesting places, their resting places, their habitat. So if you make a record of a mammal, in the future, if there's a development plan for that area, they might need to reconsider the development in many ways if there are certain mammals present. And perhaps not more importantly, but a very important reason why to record mammals is that it's a super fun way to connect with the natural world. So to get out in the countryside and to start looking for and surveying for mammals is so much fun, and you can really sort of connect with nature in a really deep way. So making a record. So what is a record? Well, essentially it's some key details about a mammal. Now for most people, encounters with mammals will include maybe a hedgehog in your garden, you might see a roadkill badger, it might even be a mouse that the cat brought in. But when you make a record of a mammal, there are some really key things and really important things to make a note of. And this is a general form that you can use to make a record of a mammal, or you can take out surveying. And in bold are the four really, really key things. So when you make a record, these are the things you absolutely must include. And that's the date that you've seen the mammal, the recorder, which will be you, the species, usually the common name, and the grid reference, which is which tells you the location, tells someone that's looking at your record the location that the mammal was found. There's some optional things to include which can be really useful. So a site name, which could be a village, it could be a particular woodland that you saw the mammal in. You can also include the scientific name of the mammal if you know it. A verifier's name is quite important. You could pop that in notes. So what that means is, especially when you're first starting out surveying for mammals, you might see a sign or a mammal and you're not sure on what it is. You have a guess, but you might send a photo of it to someone else who you know knows more about mammals, and they might say, yes, you're right, it's this, or no, it's this mammal instead. So that would be the verifier. You're still the original recorder, but that's someone that's just verifying your record for you. That can be really useful as well, because if you're submitting records, if you find something that's particularly rare, some people might not necessarily know for sure that you've got that record right. So having someone else's name against that record to verify it can be a really important way for your record to be more given more credibility. Another thing which can be quite useful to include is the type of evidence. So it might be that you've seen a live animal or a dead animal. It might be that you've seen a field sign like a footprint or some droppings. So that can be important. Abundance, so the amount of animals you've seen. You might have seen one hedgehog in your garden, or you might have seen a whole family. And habitat. So you could put very vague habitat criteria here, such as woodland, riverbank. You can also put specific habitat criteria. So there's a book I'm going to share with you a little bit later on called How to Find and Identify Mammals. And at the back of it, it has what's called a recording form code card, and it has different codes for different types of habitats. Very, very specific, so you could use the code if you wanted to. If you are surveying for mammals rather than making a simple record, and we're going to talk more about surveying in depth next, there might be some other things you might include. So you might include the survey method, and you might also include biometric data, which is if you are handling the mammals, you might record their weight, their sex, their life stage, and other notes about them as well. So before you survey, what things might you need to think about? Well, when we say survey for mammals, this is drawing up a species list for a site. So this is kind of noting presence or possible absence. And it's important to note that I say possible absence. If you don't find signs of a certain mammal or you don't see a certain mammal on a site, it doesn't mean they are absent. You can't say that for sure. But what we are doing is drawing a list of what's present. And a good place to start, once you know the site you're surveying, and for this I'm going with the Field Studies Council Centre at Preston Montford. You can use websites such as the NBN Atlas, and on there you can search for records. So you can search for particular groups, you can search for particular species, you can search for an area. And for this, what I've done is I've zoomed in on Preston Montford, all species, and I've clicked mammals. So you can see a list of all the mammals that are present there. That's all in Shropshire. And you can narrow that down, so you could click, for example, at the top yellow-necked mouse, see how many records are there. And this is really important. It will help you sort of get a feel for what you are likely to find on a site. So there might be certain species that you think, there's a lot of records on this site, so I should definitely find this or signs of this species in my survey. It might be that you notice there are certain records missing that you think that animal should be present, and that could be because there's a lack of survey in the area. It could be that no one's done a focus survey method for that species. So this is a really, really important thing to do before you start your survey, so you get a feel for what you might be looking for. You can also ask local people for anecdotal evidence. So it might well be that someone says, oh, I get a hedgehog in my garden every day, but they don't make a record of it because not everyone knows that you can make records. So it can be useful to speak to the local people in the area and just see what they've seen as well. Now, your next step would be to start looking at the habitat within your site. So again, we've got Preston Montford here. You can do this in a couple of ways. You might want to visit your site. You might decide that you're going to go for a little wander around your site and have a look what's there. But also looking at maps can be really useful. Now I've got two different maps here. On the left we've got an OS map, and on the right we've got a satellite view. And both are really useful in this instance. So you can see in the satellite map on the right, we can see a lot of woodland. And a few things that we can see which aren't on the other map are we can see big individual trees and fields. And whereas if we look the other way around, we can't see that there's ponds on that map, whereas the map on the left shows us that there are a few big ponds. So it can be quite important to look at a few different types of map to see what habitat areas you have. So this will be used to inform what you do next. So there is a variety of focus survey methods, which I'm going to talk about, and a general transect route that you might draw on. I'll talk a bit more in depth about that in a little bit. So let's talk about some focus survey methods and why we might use them. So the hazel dormouse, as mentioned, is endangered. It's a European protected species, which means that individual animals and their resting and nesting places are protected by law. Therefore, you need a license to disturb them, and you need to train for that license. And one way that we surveyed for the hazel dormouse, because it's quite an elusive creature and it's a nocturnal creature and they're very rare, so you're unlikely just to see them when you walk through a woodland, is we put up nest boxes. And this data contributes data to the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme, and that's been really, really useful because it's told us, for example, that dormice have declined massively since the year 2000, and that scheme has been going for, I believe, over 30 years now. So that's one specific survey method. There are other survey methods for dormice as well. Another reason you might have a specific survey method is for an animal that has declined dramatically and there's maybe a nationwide push to trying to get records of that animal. So one of those is the hedgehog. Hedgehogs have declined massively, and so there have been a number of pushes from different organisations to get people to record hedgehogs in their garden. Now, not everyone will see that they've got hedgehogs in their garden. One really, really great way of finding out if you have them is to put up footprint tunnels. You can see that on the left. And essentially what this is a big tube, and it's got paper, it's got ink pads, and it's got food. So essentially a hedgehog will walk in, get the food, and walk back out again with ink on its feet. It's biodegradable and animal friendly, and leave footprints. And hedgehog footprints are quite distinctive, so you can distinguish them from other animals that might get in there, such as mice and shrews. So that's a really, really nice method that anyone can do in their garden that can produce records and help build up a picture of where hedgehogs are in the country. Another reason you might need a focus survey method is when an animal is particularly elusive. So weasels and stoats are considered to be very abundant. However, there's not enough evidence to tell us this for sure. And that's because not only are they very elusive, but they don't really leave many obvious signs, or at least not in obvious places. So there's currently a new survey method being developed, and it involves something called a mostella. And it's a box which has a camera in it and it has a tube at the other end which they run through. So that's currently being trialled and will be rolled out in the future. It's a really interesting way of surveying for those small mustelid species. Now, another really lovely sort of focus survey method is small mammal trapping, and a lot of you watching this video may have already taken part in small mammal trapping at a field studies centre. Small mammals like voles, mice and shrews, they are considered to be incredibly abundant, but they're very small, often they're nocturnal. You're very unlikely to see them or see them to the extent where you can identify to species if they just run past you on a footpath, for example. The signs that they might leave, like droppings and footprints, are very, very small and hard to identify. But also it's very important to know whether they're present. They are a really, really important source of food for much other wildlife. So we can carry out a trapping survey. There are a few different types of traps. The one pictured is a tube trap. It's one of the most common traps used, along with another trap called a Longworth trap. All have their pros and cons. Tube traps are a little bit cheaper, but Longworth traps are considered a little bit more long-lasting and a little bit more effective. Essentially, you would identify, as we saw before, different types of habitat across your survey area, and you would place at least 10 traps in each of those habitat areas. So for example, when we're looking at Preston Montford, I might say I want to place 10 traps in an area of woodland, 10 along a hedgerow, 10 around one of the ponds, and 10 in some grassland. So you want to really cover all the different kind of habitat areas across your site. I really recommend attending a specific training session for small mammal trapping. There are a lot of really crucial considerations when you're carrying out this survey to ensure really that you meet welfare standards and that you meet sort of legislation requirements as well. So there's a few important things to consider when carrying out a survey. And also training can help you to learn how to better place the traps to improve your trapping success, and also identification. So you may be able to effectively place traps and catch animals, but how do you identify them in the hand? Can you tell the difference between a bank vole and a field vole, for example, or a common shrew and a pygmy shrew? So I'm not going to go into depth on that now in this session, but I highly recommend attending a specific training session for that survey method. Okay, so we move on from focus survey methods to what I like to call, technically speaking, a bit of a wonder. There are a lot of mammals that can't be specifically surveyed for, and it might be that they are particularly elusive. It might be that you're just unlikely to see them live. Maybe they're nocturnal, maybe there aren't many of them. If you think about when you walk through, when you go on a walk, you're not really going to, or you're very lucky if you see a badger wander across the footpath in front of you, deer nearby. So what we do when we want to find or we want to make a record of other mammals that we might not be able to survey for specifically is we look for signs that they've left, field signs, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, or a lot more about in a minute. And to do that, we have to create a route. So let's go back to our maps. Again, you want to take into account all different areas of habitat. And actually, the book that I mentioned previously has got, on page 4, I don't know whether you'll be able to see this very well, but it's got a table and it's got different general habitats. So woodland, riverside, urban garden, mountain moorland, farmland and grassland. And it's got a whole list of mammals and where you might be likely to find them. So that can be very good for using alongside planning your route. So essentially you're planning a transect route. And you want your route to go through every single sort of different type of habitat, and each part of that, so we can see that there are 3 key areas of woodland on this map. You've got one along the river, you've got one around the Preston Montfort Centre and one around the ponds. You'd want to do all of that. And another really sort of important thing to do is to trace the edges of these habitats. So for example, if you have a woodland, you might say, oh, I'm going to zigzag through the woodland. I'm going to just do a zigzag all the way through. And it means I'll cover most of the woodland. And yes, you'll cover a lot of space, but that will also take you a lot of time and you might not be very likely to find signs. It's almost like a needle in a haystack. However, if you think of some of the bigger mammal species, they're going to be moving between habitats. So they're going to be moving from that woodland maybe to grassland nearby or down to a stream. So actually the places you're most likely to see movement are going to be around the edges of those habitats. So it's not necessary to go through an entire woodland, but to do a walk all around the edge of it, you're going to see places where animals are going in and out of that woodland. So that's really important to consider when you plan your transect route. It's also important that you note places where you're likely to see mammal signs and maybe specific mammal signs, and this can be where it's helpful to have an idea of background of the ecology of a lot of the mammals that you might see. So for example, if you have some really wet muddy areas of footpath or you've got a riverbank, you're more likely to see footprints. And it might well be that there are other things that you don't notice until you're on your survey. So for example, some places that might be really, really good to look for signs are collapsed stone walls, holes at the bases of trees, mole hills, not just for moles, but other animals will leave droppings on top of them, piles of logs, tree stumps, fallen trees. So you're sort of intentionally biasing the survey. You want to try and find as many mammal signs as you can. And if you want this survey to be easily replicated in the future, you'll need to make a record of all those while you're on your survey. So you've got your transect route, which someone can follow again, but you'll also need to mark all these places that you have visited to look for signs, so that if someone copies it in the future and you want to do scientific comparisons, they're looking in exactly the same places. Okay, so we're going to talk about field signs now. What are field signs? I've kind of mentioned them throughout this talk so far. They are signs that animals leave behind that indicate they're present. So, time to get your pen and paper again. I'm going to give you a few prompts, and I'd like you to try and think about as many field signs as you can. So these prompts are very general kind of categories for field signs. So we have food, we have moving, and we have home. So the sorts of signs you might get are within food. You might have things like droppings, you might have remains of food. That could be things like herbivorous remains like nibbled grass, or it might be carnivorous remains. With moving, it might be talked about movement between habitats. It might be trails that you see, it might be footprints. And for homes, that could be holes in the ground, whether that be for small mammals or much larger ones. It could be nests. It could just be simply areas where animals lie up and they have a rest for the day. There are a whole load of field signs, and here are just a few examples. So we've got a hole in the ground there, caused by some small mammal, probably a rat. Have some nibbled nuts, some carnivorous droppings. We've got some hair caught on wire. Got some marks on trees. Got some footprints, a nest. We've got remains of an animal outside a hole. We've even got dead animals. You might see dead animals while on your survey, and you might see live animals as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the common field signs that you might see in a little bit. But how do you find those field signs? So there's something called the art of seeing. Sounds a little bit pretentious, but essentially it's about noticing things in the landscape around you. And it can take a little bit to get your eye in. It can take a little bit of practice. So if you look at the first picture on that slide, can you see that there's a track there? If I get my cursor, hopefully you can see this. There's some bramble all up the side here. And if we go to the other side, there's bramble here. But in the middle, there's not so much bramble, and there's a bit of an indent. Now it's covered with leaf litter. It's not very bare, but there's a definite track there. It might be that it's not very well used. It might be that it's old, but there is a track there. If we go to the next picture, you can see something a little bit more obvious. So we've got a lovely hawthorn hedge, and we've got some vegetation, but right down the middle, it's quite well worn. And we can just see in that hedge, there's a really bare bit of earth and a gap in the hedge. And if we go to the next picture, we can see that there is some bare earth here at the front, and actually there's some soil. It's a very different colour because it's been very recently dug out in a mound as well. So it's really about getting your eye in and starting to notice these things, and when you notice them, that's what you want to follow. So you follow them, and then you'll start to see the sorts of field signs that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and you start to build up a bigger picture. And essentially, the way I like to look at it is, if you imagine a landscape without any animals in it, just vegetation, apart from water, there would be, and weather, there would be no movement. So you'd just have unbroken hedgerows, you'd have woodlands, you'd have grass that had no depressions in it. However, when you put animals into the equation, there will be movement. So you want to look at a landscape as if it should be unbroken, and then notice where it is actually broken by this movement. And it can take a little bit of practice. So I've just got a couple of videos for you now, which will show you that in practice. It will show just very briefly me out in the field and noticing these kind of areas where there is movement. So we'll have a look at them now. So I'm walking along a footpath, which is along the edge of some grassland on that side, and next to on the other side is the river. So you can imagine this might be quite a good place to look for some tracks and signs. So the sort of thing that you might notice is here on this side, we can see, if you can see that on my camera, there's loads of nettles here. There's trees this side, there's some quite tall grass here, but in the middle here, it's really short grass. And actually, the bare earth of the footpath seems to move out at a bit of a point here. So what we've got here is a little bit of a track. So it's well worn, well, fairly well used anyway, with the bare earth there and the vegetation short. So it would be here where I would follow that into the field and start to look and see what else I could find. You might find much more obvious tracks as well, and usually where you've got one on one side, you'll find a track on the other as well. So if we go a little bit further, I notice there's a little bit of a break in vegetation here, which goes down to the river. Go a little bit further on, and just down here you can see coming up on my right is a bare patch, and on the left is a matching patch. So you can see it's a bit of a track here. It's obviously worn down from someone coming through quite often. You can see that they are going to be quite short, as there's a barrier there, so we're not going to have a deer or anything big through there. So badger or fox, could also be dog. Remember that dogs will be running up and down on footpaths where humans are. So let's go down to the other side. You can see there's a matching track on this side. Now it's worth knowing your area, so I can tell you there's a lot of fishermen around here. There's a lot of spots like this where people sit and fish. So this could well be human made, but this is the sort of thing that you're looking out for. So I'd follow this and see where it leads me and see if I can find any footprints. Down by riverbanks is a really good place to look for footprints. You can imagine there's a lot of wet mud. You might well get animals like otter and minks dragging themselves out. You might get rats, small mammals, badgers and foxes going down for a drink. So they're really, really excellent areas to look for footprints. So you can see how you might start to notice movement in the landscape and notice tracks that you can follow to find other field signs. It's also worth mentioning that it can be really useful to try and get into the mindset of different animals, whether it's specific mammals or just generally, and start thinking about maybe where these animals might live, you know, where they might make their home, what they might eat when they're traveling. Are they traveling to hunt? Are they traveling to seek other types of food? Where do they put their droppings? So they use them territorially or otherwise, and really sort of get into the mindset of mammals, and then you might start to notice more features in the landscape. So it can take a lot of practice to build this up, but it's really, really fun trying to do that. So now we are going to look at some common field signs, some that you might be most likely to find, and their diagnostic features. So we're going to start off by looking at badger signs. So this is a badger footprint, and you can see that it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 toes. Now often you might only see 4 toes. It depends on how wet the soil is. This is very wet soil, so we've got a very, very nice print here, but you might often just see the 4. But another key feature is you get very, very visible claw marks. So again, because this is such wet mud, you can actually see the entire length of the claw. But usually you'll just get the tips here. You get little holes at the top, a little bit away from the toes. Another thing you can see is that this print has a very, very large pad, and it's sort of kidney shaped. And the toes are sort of in line directly above that pad. So they're not in a curve at all. They're in a line directly sort of above it. And it's really important to measure your footprints as well. Okay, it's very good practice to carry a ruler with you and take a photograph of the ruler next to a print in case you want help identifying, or just for your own records. But I can tell you this print is approximately 5 centimetres wide, which is quite big. So we have got a badger footprint. Then you might also find badger setts. So badgers are social animals. They tend to live in a set that's underground, and it's a network of tunnels and chambers where they live together. So you tend to get multiple holes. Now, for badger setts, because they dig out so much soil for all the tunnels and the chambers that they create, you get massive amounts of soil on the outside, and you can see this set entrance. There's loads and loads of fresh soil here, loads of sandy soil here. So you'll get lots of, and often you'll get massive kind of piles of soil outside. A set entrance, we saw one on a previous slide. So really lots of material. They're also creatures of habit, and because they live in these full time, they go in and out a lot. So you'll get these really sort of worn runs into the set. So you can see there's an indent here. They're quite low to the ground animals. Obviously, their belly's rubbing the floor a lot. They're going back and forth a lot. So you get this sort of indent. So you can see it's really, really well worn. There's not much kind of debris in here. So you can see either side, there's loads of sticks and leaf litter, but there's not much in here, again, because they're going back and forth a lot. And also because they are that low to the ground, they're often going to leave hair, it'll get caught in the mud. So we'll look at hair a little bit more in depth in just a second. But you might get sort of black and white hair stuck in here as well, which will be indicative not only that it's a badger set, but that it is currently active. So that can be really, really important. You might also see badger droppings. So badgers will dig holes in the ground and deposit their droppings in here. It's known as a dung pit, and if you see multiple of those in one area, it's a latrine. And they do this because it signifies territorial boundaries and often used runs. So it kind of signifies to other social groups of badgers where their territory is. Badgers are omnivores, they'll eat a whole range of things, so you'll often get different coloured droppings in there, as you can see here. The middle's quite dark, might be lots of invertebrates, slugs and earthworms that they've eaten. On the right it's a bit lighter, we've got some sort of corn husks, and on the left a lot more vegetation in that one. So that can be a key feature. And also the smell is really indicative. So I said at the start that I often spend a lot of time getting close to mammal poo. Now I don't want to pick it up with my bare hands, but what I will do is get a stick that's nearby and poke it in and then smell the stick. So it can be really indicative, that smell, and for badger droppings they smell really musky. It's certainly not unpleasant or not incredibly unpleasant, but it's a very sort of specific smell that you associate with badgers. Also, it's quite important to think about where you're finding these. So you're kind of building up the bigger picture while you do this. So I've noted here that this was found near a wide, well-used run. So we're kind of starting to put together all these things that we're seeing together. Often one field sign on its own might not be enough to be indicative of a certain species. And it's important not to make a record unless you're absolutely sure of the species. But when you see multiple, you can start to build up the picture and say, right, we've definitely got badger here. Let's look at one more thing. So I've got badger hair. So it's usually black and white. Not always. You do get albino badgers and ginger badgers, and also you might get other animal hair that is that colour. So don't go by colour alone. But it's also very, very long hair. It's one of the longest sort of hairs of mammals that you'll see. And there's some really key features that tell you that it's badger. So it has this thing called rolling resistance. So if you're to run it between your thumb and forefinger, it sort of gets stuck. It feels like it's got edges. It's not easy to roll. Whereas if you get one of your own hairs and roll it between your thumb and forefinger now, it's very smooth. It rolls easily. So that's a really key feature of badger hair. And another is that if you bend it, it tends to spring back. So it's not very brittle. It doesn't really snap or permanently crease. It tends to just spring back. So that's indicative of badger hair. And again, when you're building up the bigger picture, this was found at the entrance to a set. Often you will find badger hair caught on barbed wire. Particularly where they go, they might go back and forth a lot. They're creatures of habit, so they might go back and forth under a bit of barbed wire fence again and again, and their back scrapes on the barbed wire, and lots of their hair gets caught in it. So it could be a really good place to look for badger hair. So let's move on to another animal, and there's lots of common signs that you might see of fox. So this is fox poo. Very key thing about it is its smell. So foxes smell very, very foul. And their poo smells foul, but also their urine. So quite often you can smell just where a fox has crossed the path, just by getting your nose in and sniffing the air, and you'll start to pick up on when foxes have been about. And you can often do the same for badgers early in the morning when they've been foraging the night before as well. These droppings, they will usually contain a lot of fur and bone. So if you get your trusty stick that you're going to use to poke it, you don't often need to do that with fox poo. If it's old, you might. You can pull it apart and start to see what's in it. It's very twisty, so carnivorous droppings are twisty. You can see this at the ends here and here, and usually that will be made up of fur and hair there, which is creating that twist. And foxes also use their droppings in a territorial way, so usually it will be left in quite a prominent place. It might be left on a tree stump. I've seen it left outside badger sets. They might leave it on molehills sometimes as well, or just on a footpath in a really obvious place. So that's a sort of a key factor with that, how they use their droppings. Another thing you might see is a chewed bird wing. So if you think about birds of prey, when they catch a bird, they don't have teeth, so they're going to pluck it. They pull out the feathers one by one. Whereas a fox, they've got teeth. So what they'll do is they'll hold the bird down and they'll chew the wing off. So they'll chew it all off in one go. You can see this is almost a whole bird wing. And if you look at the tips, they're not to a point. They haven't got their end anymore. They've been chewed off in this line. So you might get badgers do this as well. So this is why one of the things that's most important is to look at this in relation to other signs around and see what else is around. I can tell you this was found with some other remains, which we'll look at in a minute. And as mentioned here, it was found by a fox-sized hole. So we can start to put this together and think that this was fox that ate this bird. Fox paw prints are really, really distinctive. So they're diamond shaped for a start. You can see that here. They sort of go out and down, quite a small heel pad. They can be confused with dog, and there's a lot of different breeds of dog. But usually when you see a fox print, you know it's a fox print. You can see that the top two toes are very, very close together. And yeah, they're sort of pointed forward, and you've got these little claw marks at the top, but it's not very obvious on this picture, but you will get quite prominent claw marks at the top here. And the side two toes are exactly opposite, and that creates this sort of image where you can draw a cross through it. So can you see that we can draw a cross through here, and that is very distinctive to fox footprints. So you won't see this on dog footprints. It's very, very distinctive. You can see on this set of prints as well, we've got a front paw print here, so we've got a small heel pad there. And on the back footprint, we've got quite a big heel pad as well. And something else you can tell from these footprints is that we have a male fox. So the footprints are exactly in line. If you have a female fox, they've got hips, wider hips than a male. So this back footprint will be a little bit out to one of the sides. So this one is a fox hole. So we've talked about the shape of holes being similar to the shape of the mammal. So a fox hole is usually quite tall and narrow, like a fox. It's worth mentioning that often you will get badgers will dig into fox holes. Foxes will use badger sets. Occasionally you'll even get them cohabit. So it's worth bearing that in mind, and again why it's important to build up a bigger picture with multiple field signs. You can notice with this hole in particular that there's not much spoil outside, so it is quite a close-up, but you can see that there isn't a mound of dirt. There's also not a very well-worn path. There's quite a lot of litter here. Now that can be indicative of it not being used. However, with this one I can tell you that when I stuck my nose in, it had a very foul smell. It smelled very foxy, so it was definitely used and just not by badgers, so it's not well worn. And then often what you might find around foxholes is lots and lots of dead remains. So I put all these together for dramatic effect, but these are actually found scattered across a wider area. But here you've got a whole bunch of rabbit feet, skulls, bird wings. And often this will be found in areas where there's cubs. So foxes don't always live in holes, whereas badgers do, but foxes will have cubs in holes. And it might well be in this instance that they had cubs, they were bringing dead animals back for the cubs to eat down in their earth, and then they would kick out the remains. And also when the cubs start to hunt as well, they won't go very far from that earth, so these remains will be from fox cubs in the area. Again, you've got a smell associated with them. There was this sort of foxy smell hanging around, and it's very typical prey of foxes, so a lot of rabbits and some birds as well. So just some other common field signs you might see. This is actually otter sprain. So they live in water bodies. This was found by a river, and they produce this spraint. It's got a very distinctive smell. So there's two animals that will produce droppings that look like this, mink and otter. Mink droppings smell very, very foul, whereas otter spraint smells like jasmine tea. So it's actually got quite a sweet, pleasant smell to it. It will contain fish bones and maybe fragments of other animals such as fur, other bones. You can see in this there's a very sort of little bit of fish bone just there, and they're left in a prominent place. So again, these are used in a very territorial way. They're left as markers to let other otters know that this is their territory and they patrol this area. Now you might see herbivorous droppings as well. So this is a pile of rabbit droppings. Most people will be familiar with these. Hare droppings look very similar as well. But it's a pile of droppings, so you'll get lots and lots of them together, whereas with carnivorous droppings, you tend to just get one or two. They are spherical, they're about 1 centimetre by 1 centimetre. And these are found near a rabbit warren as well, so very indicative of the fact that they are rabbit droppings. These most people would say they would be able to identify easily. However, they can be confused with some other droppings. So you can see how these are similar. It's a pile of small droppings, so it's a herbivorous animal. But they are sort of cylindrical rather than spherical. So they're about 1 centimetre by 2 centimetre. And a key thing to notice with these is, if you look at this one in particular, it's sort of tic-tac shaped, and it's got a little bit of a point at the end. So it's a little bit like a pumpkin seed. And again, you've got one here that's a little bit like that as well. So these are actually deer droppings. Another key thing was they were found on a narrow track and in woodland. So if you're thinking about habitat, you are likely to get rabbits in woodland, but they're more likely to be on the edges or in grassland, whereas deer are going to be going through woodland. And yeah, on a narrow track that deer would go back and forth over. Let's see what the next slide is. Yes, so, and you might also find these. So these are deer tracks. Not a lot to say about them. They're made up of 2 cleaves. You can look at guides to look at the different sort of shapes that different deer species produce and how to tell them from sheep. These are quite hard to distinguish from other tracks because they're in wet mud, so they're not very defined. Sheep tracks will be a little bit more sort of wavy, a little bit more rough, whereas deer tracks will be quite, they'll have straight edges and distinct curves to them, so you can look at that. And again, this is found on a narrow track. And these are actually muntjac prints, so they're very, very small. They look a bit bigger than they would look normally because they're in wet mud, but muntjac are very, very small deer, very cute. What else might you see? So people will often get these in their garden. So this is hedgehog droppings. These are dark blue black, and they can look very shiny. They've got lots of sort of little shiny sparkly fragments in them, and that's remains of things like beetles that hedgehogs will eat. These ones are sort of quite coiled up, but they can be elongated, so they're about 1 to 1.5 centimetres wide and about 6 centimetres long, so they're quite big. And it's a very distinctive dropping with the colour. It's sort of very, very shiny black, and again found in a garden. So the person that sent me these was very excited to find out they had a hedgehog in their garden. So now I want to share with you some of the little bits and pieces that I've picked up myself while out mammal tracking and point out some diagnostic features for you. So one of the most exciting things I've ever found is this here, massive skull. So you can see that it's a herbivore. It's got lots of herbivorous teeth here, no canines, doesn't have any incisors or anything at the front. And it's quite elongated as well. This is actually a red deer skull. Red deer are our biggest deer species, and this is absolutely massive. I've also got here a smaller deer skull. This one's a fallow deer here. So again, you've got these herbivorous teeth, elongated snout. But how can you distinguish this from a sheep skull, which you're likely to come across? So I've just got a little fragment of sheep skull here. And there's 2 key things that you can look at. Well, there's lots of key things that you can look at, but just for now, something you can notice even with fragments. So hopefully you can see this on my camera. So we've got these marks here called sutures. And can you see that they're quite straight? There's a little bit of zigzagging here, not much. And same across here. It's a little bit of zigzagging, not much. Now, if we compare that to one of the deer skulls, can we see the difference? Can you see this really lovely wavy pattern? Really, really quite intricate and delicate. So that's a key feature which will tell you whether you've got a deer skull or a sheep skull. Now, another feature is if we look at the eye sockets, you can see on this one, although it's a little bit gnawed, and often there will be animals that will gnaw bones for calcium, but you can see that mostly this is very smooth. Whereas if we compare that to the fragment of sheep skull, it is a bit older, so it is likely to be a little bit more worn, but this is very, very jagged. So it's not very smooth around the eye socket. So those are two key features to help you identify whether you've got a sheep skull or a deer skull, even from perhaps the little fragment of the skull. Let's have a look. What else have we got here? So let's have a look at some more skulls. I show you this piece here. So we've got quite a small skull. We're thinking, it's a much smaller animal. We've got these incisors on the front. But how do we know whether this is something like a rabbit or a hare, or whether it's a rat or a squirrel, something like that? Well, lagomorphs, which is what a rabbit or a hare is, not only have these front incisors, but they have a very small pair just behind those teeth. You see that just there? So this is in fact a rabbit skull. This is quite a small rabbit skull, but just for size comparison, if I show you the bottom jaws of a hare and the rabbit, there's quite a noticeable difference in size between those two there. Have a look what else we've got. So you don't get many mammals that will make nests, mostly small mammals, and I can show you some dormouse nests. So these are the inner structures of dormouse maternity nests. So they tend to strip bark, usually honeysuckle bark, and they weave it together to make this gorgeous structure. And then they insulate it with green leaves. So when I say green leaves, that means leaves straight off a tree rather than leaves off the ground. So some mouse species will make nests with brown leaves, which are leaves off the ground once they're already dead, but dormice will take them straight off a tree. These are, as I mentioned, dormice are protected and their nests are protected, so don't take one of these if you see it. These were taken from nest boxes after dormice went into hibernation for the year, and taken by myself, who is licensed and can do that and take these for educational purposes. But if you see one of these in vegetation, they might be sitting in bramble, it might be in a tree hole. That's really, really exciting. So dormice are rare and endangered. It's definitely worth making a record of that and letting someone know about that. Have a look what else we've got. Some nibbled nuts. I've mentioned those a few times. So there are a lot of animals that will eat hazelnuts, and here we have a pot of hazelnuts that have been eaten by squirrels or birds. So squirrels or birds will chomp. They tend to make a mess. They crack nuts. You don't see any nibble marks. They're just really jagged, just broken, like you've got a nutcracker on them. Whereas small mammals will eat them in very different ways. So let's see what we've got in this little pot here. So bank voles tend to be quite neat. I don't know how well you're going to see this on this camera, but if you get a nibbled nut and you run your fingernail on that inner rim and you feel sort of indents, that's little tooth marks. But on this nut, if I cover the hole and have a look on the outside, there's no mess. There's no teeth marks on the outside. This is indicative of bank vole, so they'll do that. You'll get the teeth marks on the inner rim, but not on that outer rim. Whereas mice are really, really messy. So for a mouse nibbled nut, let's see if I can find a good one to share with you. So generally speaking, again, if you run your thumbnail on the inner rim, you'll be able to feel teeth marks. But if you cover that and look on the outer edge, can you see? There's lots and lots of teeth marks here. Really, really messy. So that'll be a mouse. Now we can't record that species. We don't know if it's a wood mouse or a yellow-necked mouse, but we can record it as a mouse, Apodemus in particular. But the main animal we're looking for when we look for nibbled hazelnuts is one that's been eaten by a dormouse. So these are very, very distinctive. Let's see if you can see this. So dormice open hazelnuts in a very different way. They hold them on the side and they put their teeth in and they twist them. So they kind of scrape like a tin opener. And so you get these teeth marks around the outer rim that are from holding the nut, and they generally go in one direction, clockwise or anti-clockwise. And there tends to be a little bit of a gap between the inner rim and the outer rim of tooth marks. And the inner rim won't have those radial tooth marks that you can feel when you scrape your nail in. Instead, they will go in this direction. So they're very, very distinctive. So if you find a dormice nibbled nut, you can make a record of dormice from that. So it's really, really, really sort of good one to get your eyeing for. Let's have a look. What else have we got in my box of tricks? We've got some feathers, some bird wings that have been chewed by fox. I've mentioned these. So the edges are really, really chewed there. The wings together, got quite a few of these. Another thing you can look for, which can be really quite fun, is owl pellets. So if you see a big hole in an oak tree, there might be an owl or other animals nesting in there, and they might leave pellets which look a bit like this. So it's something they regurgitate. And this one, it's got loads and loads of bones in. So they swallow animals whole, and then they're digested, and they bring up the bits that they don't need. And if you pull them apart, like I've done with this one here, you can find little tiny skulls in there. And there are guides to help you identify what species exactly they belong to. So can we see there's some very, very tiny skulls there? Little tiny jaws and teeth. So they're quite exciting. So we've talked about the art of seeing, and we've talked about field signs. So now I'm going to show you a little clip on putting that all together. It's just a short clip on going out in the field and how you might notice movement, and then have a look and notice different field signs. Hopefully you can hear my voice above the traffic and the wind, but I've been walking along this footpath for a while, and there's quite a lot of tracks on either side. See, there's one there. That's quite hard to know here because it's a well-used footpath by humans, whether a lot of these tracks are human, could even be dog. You can see on that side there's another little bare bit there, all going down to the river. However, I'm really lucky here in that if we go this way, you can see there's a really bare area here. Now we can see there's a nice little track up there. You make that out? Here, however, massive, massive area of bare earth. So what have we got? Well, we can see there's a hole there. We can see, if I can get up without falling, another hole there. And another one. And there's loads, and there's loads of tracks as well. You see the track all along the top of this bare bit. There's lots of disturbance down here, and just over here you can see the colour of that soil. So it's very different to down here. It's been dug out fairly recently. You can see there's a lot of disturbance. This would be a really good place to look for footprints. So I'm going to have a quick scan, see if we can spot anything. Mostly human, I think. And here's another hole. Now what's really nice is you can see there's a lot of disturbance at the entrance. Lots and lots of soil. And so I'm just going to have a quick look. Let's see if there's any hair. And straight away, see there's a bit sticking up here. And there's loads. There's another one here. I can see lots of little bits here. So let's do a test. Let's get that. Ooh. Now also I'm using my nose, and straight away I can smell a really sweet musky smell coming out of there. Rolling this, and it has rolling resistance, so it doesn't roll really easily between my thumb and finger. And a lot of this is very black and white, very wiry. See, my camera will focus. Can't see that very well. So you can put all this together and say that we've got a badger set, and a very active one at this. Here's another track going over there, and just another lovely little sign which I spotted. Can you see this tree here? I go around the other side, all the bark's pulled off, and we have some absolutely gorgeous scratch marks all the way up. See this? Here, all around here. You can see 4 lines there all the way up. So we've got a favourite scratching post of badgers as well. So I just want to share with you some of my favourite materials. So I've got 3 key books. Britain's Mammals, a field guide to the mammals of Britain and Ireland. So this book is absolutely amazing. It only came out a couple of years ago. It's got every single mammal that you might find in Britain, and it's just beautiful. It has colour photos of every species, lots of bats there. Some really beautiful photos. It also has distribution maps for every species as well, which is really, really handy. And it has it has categories for every mammal. So it has ID features, it's got signs that you might see, habitat, breeding behaviour. It's got so much information. So I highly recommend this book. It's absolutely wonderful. Then we've got my absolute favourite book for tracking, How to Find and Identify Mammals. So you can see that's very well worn. I would say this is a beginner's book, but to be honest, for mammal survey, you don't really need anything more than this. This has got everything that you could ever need about tracks and signs in. So it has some really handy little tables. I mentioned at the start one about habitats of mammals. It has a table about different sounds that you might hear. It's got key identification features with commonly confused species. It has also some really, really nice, if I can find some really nice dropping charts as well. So some sort of comparison features for different droppings as well, key features for those. It's got footprints. It's even got a really nice mammal survey recording form that you can photocopy as well at the back. Let's find that for you, which mine, you saw in one of my slides, is based off. It's absolutely amazing, and a really nice little feature as well, which is one of the reasons I like to take this book out with me, is it's got a ruler on the bottom. So a lot of the footprints are to scale. You can hold this against a footprint that you might see, or you can take a photo using the ruler and hope that someone else can ID it for you. So I love this book, absolutely adore it, one of my favourites, highly recommend it. It's quite cheap too, it's about 12 quid. And then the final book is really a key thing for small mammal trapping. So you've got a little book, Live Trapping Small Mammals, a Practical Guide. It's about £5. It's a very small book, but it's invaluable really. So I talked about that I highly recommend going on a training session if you are wanting to live trap small mammals. But alongside that, I really recommend this book. It's got a lot of really important information for if you're going to do that. Now, finally, I just want to talk a little bit about support and further learning. So, my business is Scruff Stuff and I have a Facebook page. I am more than happy for you to message me photos of field signs or post them to my page. More than happy to give advice to help to point you towards the direction of good resources to help identify, for example, a footprint, or to give you the answer, or to be a verifier for you if you want to make a record of something. More than happy to help out, so do feel free to message me. Also, if you're in Shropshire, we have Shropshire Mammal Group, or if you're not in Shropshire, most counties have a local mammal group. So they are absolutely invaluable. For example, Shropshire Mammal Group put on training sessions. They're currently surveying towards a mammal atlas for Shropshire. There's all sorts of experts that you can speak to. So we have our very own kind of skulls and bones expert that you can ask for advice if you find some good skulls. They have Facebook groups as well, so your local mammal group is a really, really valuable resource. I'd highly recommend signing up as a member as well. You get a newsletter from Shropshire Mammal Group, which is amazing. And finally, the Mammal Societies. That's the national organisation, and they're absolutely brilliant. If you're a member, they send out a publication, I think it's quarterly, with lots of lovely stories and new scientific studies about mammals. And they provide a lot of training as well. So there's a lot of training sessions that you can go on to learn more about tracking or ecology of different mammals, in particular those that are protected by legislation, those that you need a licence for, that kind of thing. So highly recommend checking them out as well. So I hope this has been useful for you. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions or anything, do feel free to contact me on my page or to drop a comment in this YouTube video, and I'll try and answer as best as I can. Thank you very much for watching, and happy mammal tracking.